Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brooke Vichinsky, and I am the Manager of Client Experience for the Center for Professional and Executive Development. I am excited to have you with us here today for this webinar while we hear from Susan Zelmanski. Before I introduce Susan, I would like to share a few words about the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development, or CPED as we like to call it, because that's a lot of words. So the Center for Professional and Executive Development offers programs and certificates that give you the modern, relevant skills needed to skills needed to advance your career. I don't normally do this, so bear with me. I am filling in today. All of our programs offer interactive live learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. If you have any questions throughout the webinar that you'd like to ask, you can submit those questions using either the chat or the Q&A buttons on the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. We will pose questions that are submitted during the Q&A at the end of today's webinar. I also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be made available within the next few days. And that email that goes out with the link to the recording will also include some contact information for our staff members that were not able to make it here today. So I would now like to introduce Susan and hand it on over.
Right. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be with you today and share just a little bit around influencing and specifically influencing up. This is kind of my life's work. So I have two major areas of content that I write about, that I research about, and that I teach. One is around working cross-functionally, otherwise known as a matrix organization, when you have to kind of break out of silos and work across. And the other one is actually a subset of that, which is influence. And so both of those I teach at CPED, some version of that, as well as in my own private practice. So all I do is exactly what I'm doing today in terms of any kind of influence working across when you don't have authority. And I do it in workshop form, webinar form, coaching, assessments, all of that. So I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit of that with you today. What our objectives are is the first thing I'm going to start with is a usable framework for influence. So in general, not just influencing up, but in general, what's a framework we can use for influence? Because the idea here is that influence is something that we do intuitively, right? No one on this webinar today has ever not influenced. This is not a brand new skill, but we tend to do it fairly instinctively, and we kind of intuit our way through it. And the work that I do, I really try to put a framework, labels, some structure around it so that you can do it more consistently and you can do it more deliberately. And anytime you do something more consistently and more deliberately, you're going to do it more effectively. So we're going to start there with a framework that that we use, and we use in our courses as well on influence. And then I have 4 very specific tips for you on influencing up. So those are our objectives. This is the model that we use. And to give you a little bit of background on this, this model has kind of been crowdsourced, right? But when I think back to, golly, it's probably been 12 years ago, when I sat down to get content around influence down on paper for the first time, I was completely stuck. And so what I did is I reached out to do a little bit of research to see what other people were saying around influence. And what I found when I reached out was a whole bunch of literature on persuasion, right? So how to have a persuasive conversation, how to form an argument. And it was very much, it read as if the people I was teaching were salespeople, right? That they're going to sell somebody a used car. It was very persuasion focused. And so I was stuck because that's not really what influence is within organizations. It's very different. And so I was stuck and I delayed and I procrastinated because anytime I'm stuck, that's my method of coping is I just procrastinate and put it off. I was at lunch with somebody and I said, what everybody is not writing about is the other part of influence. There's two parts to influence in organizations. One happens before the influence, and one happens when you're influencing. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's the foundation of how I want to tackle influence. And I think how we should define it within organizations. So the two pieces are build proactively and in the moment. Build proactively is the reality of there are things that you do every day um, that really help you be described as influential. So this top part of the model, that in red, is the degree to which you are influential, the adjective, right? So we do those day in, day out, and I'll walk you through each one of those in terms of what I mean by that. But as I say in this little blurb, your reality is that your level of influence in any given moment is built on an ongoing basis, well before your first PowerPoint slide or the first opening comment that you're going to make to somebody. You come in with a history, right? And then the second piece is the more traditional view of influence, which really is the actual persuasive piece of this. And so in the moment is really thinking about the steps that you take to prepare and to conduct and to follow up on influence dialogues. So those are the two big divisions. Let me give you a little bit more detail on each of the components within that. First and foremost, it's partnerships, right? So if this model was built to scale, that little, I don't know if you'd call it a slice of pie, that slice would be bigger than all the other pieces in the model. Partnerships are critical to that. And they're critical because without trust, you can't have influence. Without people trusting you, they're not gonna trust your idea, your suggestion, your need, your solution, your decision. So trust is a huge piece of it. So when we build trusting partnerships throughout the organization, again, my focus is across the organization, up, down, diagonal, right? When you build trust like that and you influence within the context of a partnership, you just speed things up, right? If we go back to those PowerPoint slides, it takes far fewer PowerPoint slides to influence a partner, right? So the other thing that partners do is they expand your network. So when you're thinking about having to influence something, like I always go back to a real simple idea of influencing the color of conference room chairs. If I don't know the person, I don't have a partnership with the person who's in charge of conference room chairs, but I have a partner who does have a relationship with that person, I can work with and through that person to influence, right? I can gain perspective from that partner. They can be my ally or my advocate. They could be my surrogate. So partnerships, when you're influencing directly, make it a much more efficient process. And when you're influencing indirectly, it makes it possible. So partnerships is a big deal. And every day we build those. The next piece of it is willing to demonstrate a willingness to be influenced and really having a balanced flexibility where there's some give and some take. So one of the more counterintuitive pieces of this is the most influential people in organizations are those that are willing to be influenced by others. Those people that are kind of stubborn with their ideas and aren't open to the ideas of others, they aren't influenceable, gradually lose their level of influence. By the same token, those who are overly flexible and kind of, don't take a stand, also lose their influence. So that idea of maintaining a give and take and being very conscious of your level of flexibility is really important. And again, you're doing that every day, demonstrating flexibility, demonstrating balanced flexibility. And the final one is the people that are most influential are those that see a problem and the solution from a perspective beyond what I call the tip of their nose. So they are able to see a problem or the solution from a broader perspective than just their own needs. And so the more knowledge you build, the more you're able to position your ideas. The more knowledge you build, the more you're able to understand what you can influence and what is, kind of a sacred cow that's untouchable, who you should be influencing, how you should be influencing, and even when you should be influencing. So the broader your knowledge is, the better equipped you are to influence. So these are the three proactive pieces of this. You forge meaningful partnerships, you balance your flexibility, and you broaden, you keep your perspective broad. So at any given time, every day, these are the realities of the things that you're doing to increase your influence within the organization. Again, influence as an adjective. The bottom piece of that is all around when I have an actual influence opportunity, what steps do I take? And so each of these, starting with prepare, really helps you think about influence as a very strategic skill. So one of the things I say over and over again in our full 2-day workshop around this is that influence is a strategic skill. It's actually not a conversational skill. And we'll talk about dialogue in a minute, but influence is very strategic. And so preparation in this case is really thinking about all of the different stakeholders to anything you've got to influence. And how do I sequence my conversations? How do I think through the information that I'm going to present? And so it's a very deliberate way of thinking through how you're going to influence. And sometimes we get so charged up about an idea that we have that we convince ourselves that we don't have to do the hard work of influence and thinking through a strategy. I've got this amazing idea, or maybe I have this compelling need. I'm going to go straight to the decision maker and they are going to see it just like I see it. And that more than likely is not necessarily the case. So preparation is all about looking at stakeholders and looking at your message and preparing both of those. The next one is dialogue. So, in order to be influenced, people need to feel heard. If they don't feel heard and understood, then they're not really open to influence. And so, the influence dialogue is more than just presenting, here's what I've got, here's what I need, and advocating for that need. It really is making sure that you are meeting your stakeholders where they are, and that they feel heard and understood by you. And so this dialogue piece of it is just as much about the questions you ask and the demonstration of listening that you do as it is the arguments that you pose. As a matter of fact, when I look at our 2-day program, people walk into that class, I think, thinking that this is going to be a class about the talk of influence, right? About the persuasive, how do I have an influential dialogue? Over 2 days, I don't even think we spend 2 hours on the dialogue. Because if you've got all those pieces on the top lined up, and if you've done your prep, the dialogue is actually pretty straightforward. We'll talk about, dynamics and things like that, but that's actually a smaller piece of the model than I think most people think. So that's dialogue. And then the final one is follow-up. So, as most of you have probably experienced, a lot of times we think we've influenced because everybody nodded their head. Yeah, 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 we're on board. You got it. And then poof, nothing happens. And so the reality is that most likely your stakeholders are busy, dynamic people. And they may have said yes and nodded their head and fully meant that, but they forgot, or it got deprioritized, or they changed their mind. There's all kinds of reasons why people nod their head but don't do anything. So our role as influencers is less about getting nodding heads and getting agreement and more about getting action. So if you get a yes, there's still work to be done to make sure that it actually comes through. And if you get a no, there are steps you can take to try again. And to relook at that and to address it again at another time. So, really good influencers are pretty perseverant and pretty persistent. And so, follow up is a big piece. Whether you get a yes or a no, there's always a follow up piece to that. So, that's the model that we're dealing with as a whole. I'll pause now. Does anybody have any questions? Just raise your Zoom hand or put it into chat. Any questions on the model in general before we start talking about influencing up? Anybody? Okay, let's go ahead and we will move on. So, couple of challenges that I'd like to challenge a couple of assessments for you. And one of them I already alluded to. One is around passion. So, passion is a big part of being able to influence because a lot of times passion brings you energy, right? And you bring energy into that influence opportunity, and it can be very engaging for people. Passion is probably what brought the idea to you in the first place, right? So passion is huge, but oftentimes passion can trip us up, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. The other thing that I think that we assume is that expertise is our major influence lever. And I would say that if expertise was all we needed in influence, we wouldn't need this webinar. I probably wouldn't have written a book about it. CPED wouldn't be offering what workshops. Expertise is not necessarily enough. And related to that, often data isn't either, right? So some of you may have experience, especially those of you in financial services, where you've got the data, but that doesn't drive agreement, right? Oh my gosh, it's crystal clear. It's right here. And they still don't see it or they still don't agree to it. It's because humans are more complex than that. We don't work on algorithms. And so challenge the role of passion, expertise, and data is really important because all of those tell you you can shortcut it, right? The idea is so good, or I'm such an expert, or I've got so much data that I am going to come in. I'm not going to do my prep. I'm not going to think through stakeholders. I am just going to come in with my passion or my expertise and or data, and it's going to be so good and so compelling that I actually don't have to influence. I just need to inform. And so really challenging that is important. And it's an important thing, an important mindset to have if you're going to begin to go through and approaching influence in a very different, less intuitive, and more intentional way. So I would challenge you on those three pieces, which traditionally are our drivers of influence. All right. So with that in mind, let's talk about bosses. Right. So when we're influencing up, not necessarily a boss, but we're influencing with somebody who has more power than us, right? And this creates an especially challenging situation. And most of it, quite honestly, is mental. The challenging situation that we cook up in our head makes it seem bigger than it really is. Because regardless of where you fall in an organization, you're still a human and you're still influencing human to human. So, all of those things that I talked through with you on that model slide also come into play. It doesn't matter what level they're at, you're going to need to meet them where they are. It doesn't matter what level they're at, they still want to be heard and understood. It doesn't matter what level they're at, they still need to trust you. It doesn't matter what level they're at, they still want to know that you have gone about this and talked with other stakeholders and that your perspective is broad. So when you're influencing up, the rules don't change, but I think something in our mindset does. And so I think one of the first things we need to do is to realize that regardless of title, human nature is human nature, and human nature doesn't disappear. And the realities of influence doesn't disappear at some threshold, at some level, at some title. So, tip number one is you got to be trustworthy, right? And so, what does that mean, and what does that bring you? So, trustworthiness, like I mentioned, that if you are in a situation either where that person doesn't trust you. So there's kind of a negative trust perception or negative, Covey calls it a bank account. You're negative in the trust bank account, or it's just plain neutral. Doesn't mean you can't influence them. It just means your strategy is going to look very different, right? So that just means that you're going to have to do extra homework. You're going to really have to build your knowledge. You're going to really need to do a lot on the prepare piece of things, and be incredibly prepared in terms of each phase of what you're going to walk them through. You're going to want to do even more stakeholder analysis, and really think through that dialogue. So it's not that it's impossible if trust isn't there, or it's just neutral in terms of kind of an unknown. You can make up for it by using different parts of the model, but boy, is it a lot easier if you're influencing within the context of high trust. A lot easier. So how do we build that? And what do people look for? Again, it doesn't matter the level. This is what everybody looks for in trustworthiness. They look for people who are reliable. Easy breezy, right? You do what you say you're going to do. And when you don't do it, you acknowledge that. I realize I committed to getting this done by Friday. I'm not going to be able to get that. Here's why. Here's what I'm recommitting to. So they are reliable. They do what they say what they're going to do. And if for any reason they're not able to, they vocalize that. They don't try to shy away from that. They lean into that and they're very transparent about it. They are consistent. So I kind of use consistency and predictability almost synonymously with this. So there is a consistency in your communication, right? There is a consistency in the facts that you provide. There is a consistency in your work product. There is a consistency in your decisions. There's a consistency in your reactions to things. You are predictable, right? That feels solid. That builds trustworthiness, right? And then there is the final one, which is acknowledge. And I kind of mention it on the reliability piece. And it goes with a consistency piece as well. You've got to be reliable and consistent. And when you're not, be self aware enough to acknowledge that. This acknowledge piece is really critical when we're working with higher ups because um, higher ups, when you're operating with more power, they really look towards the people who, and this is counterintuitive, who acknowledge any mistake that they have, right? They acknowledge a mistake. They don't try um, to hide it or to camouflage it or to avoid it. They're confident and self-assured enough to say, yeah, I need help with this, or I did not do this to the best of my ability, or I goofed, or I don't know. And so that sometimes sounds really risky when we're working with higher ups. But I think it's actually even more important when you're working with people that have more power, that you're able to demonstrate to them that I am secure enough and self aware enough in myself that I absolutely can acknowledge mistakes because we are all human and mistakes are made, right? The last thing you'd want to do is to have a mistake be made that that person found themselves without you letting them know. That's what really damages trust. Mistakes, I don't think always have to damage trust, but I think not acknowledging mistakes definitely, definitely damages trust, right? So that's the first one. Be trustworthy. And this is not an easy one for us to evaluate, right? To be able to shine a mirror on ourselves and ask ourselves, am I trustworthy? We tend to, when we think of trust, we tend to think of trust in terms of to whom we're going to bestow trust on. So we look at trust from a perspective of that person's trustworthy, that person's not, that person is, that person's not. So we look at trust as an evaluation versus as something that we actually should be evaluating ourselves on and making sure that we're trustworthy. And when we're trustworthy, your influence goes a heck of a lot smoother, right? Again, if there isn't trust, that doesn't mean you can't influence. You just change your strategy to adapt to that. right? So that is tip number one. I'm going to pause here. Looks like we've got a couple questions in chat. Okay, good. They're painfully accurate. Oh, good. I'm glad they're painfully accurate. Wonderful. Bob writes, from your experience, how well can the influence model work in an organization culture that's more top-down, command and control versus a more collaborative environment? Great question. Um, where I see that challenge, the components don't change, but when it's really top down, one of the things that I really, when I'm working with someone who is in a real hierarchical organization, and so I always say, absolutely you can influence up, you can influence up, but they're like, holy cow, you have no idea how hierarchical we are. And that's where their power lies. Like the power all resides at the top of our organization. I'm not sure I can influence it. So the question I ask myself in those situations is, am I the right influencer? So remember how I said having partnerships throughout the organization, not only do you directly influence them with ease, they broaden your network. So one of the things that I really challenge people with when you're working in a very top-down organization is just because you thought of it doesn't mean you're the influencer, doesn't mean you have to be in the seat of the influencer. You may actually be influencing somebody with maybe a at a different level to influence the ultimate person. So there just might be an extra step. So I think that reality and knowing the reality of your organization is a really important one. It's not impossible. It changes your strategy. Okay, great. Did that answer your question, Bob? Just give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Good. There's a few more considerations. I think that's the biggest one for sure. All right. Okay, got that. Wonderful. Let's go on to tip two. Tip two. Okay. Be curious. So here's where I'm going to share with you a little bit of my research. So, um, I have an assessment that is built on that model that you guys just saw. And it is um, it is an assessment where you get feedback from your partners throughout the organization. So nobody that reports to you, because that's a power differential, but how you influence across. And then you also get feedback from those you influence up, right? And you can look at the data to see, if different stakeholders view you differently, right? And so one of the other things that's interesting about this is there's 55 questions and you answer the questions twice. So you answer how important is this in our organization? And then how well does this person do it, right? So there's a lot of reasons to do that I won't get into, but that importance measure has yielded some really interesting results. So when I look at that data, and I've got a couple thousand data points at this point in for this assessment, one of the things that rises to the top. So the first things that rise to the top, it doesn't matter if it's a partner or if it's somebody higher in the organization, is you've got to be trustworthy, right? Number one, no doubt about it. I don't know why you wouldn't give that the highest thing on the scale, right? So that one is number one. And that doesn't matter which stakeholder group you're in. When I look at that leader or that influence up stakeholder group, one of the things that rises to the top there that presents even higher than the other one is curiosity. There is a direct question around curiosity. And they place a lot of importance on this. And I think that's fascinating because when you're influencing up, there's a power differential. That's like the last place you want to be curious, right? Like you want to go in there like all ready to go and like knowing your stuff. And I am Teflon and I got it all buttoned down. So for when I tell people that people higher in the organization really value curiosity, they're like, seriously? And the reason they value curiosity is because the other thing that is in their top five is broad perspective, right? So the question specifically asks, when influencing, does this person have a broad perspective on the problem and the solution? And that is really important to higher ups, that you're not influencing from the tip of their nose. right? And so what I started to say to people as kind of a shorthand, and there's a couple other questions that kind of are, associated with those two realities, is that when you're influencing up, you got to see what they see. They want you, and I don't mean take on their opinion, they want you to take on their perspective, right? So they are viewing it from up here, and they're probably seeing things that you don't see. They want you up there with them. In order to trust you, they got to know that you've thought things through the way that they would think things through. And that's challenging because you don't naturally have that perspective. You're going to have to work to get that perspective. But that be curious comes out higher when you're influencing up than when you're influencing across. When you're influencing across, they want to be seen. So leaders want you to see what they see. Your partners want you to see them. They want you to understand them. They want you to understand their realities, their priorities. They want to be seen and they want to be heard in order to be influenced by you. So, isn't that an interesting pivot from influencing up, see what I see, influencing across, see me? So, we're talking about influencing up, so I will not go down that rabbit hole, but be curious. So here is a really good watch out. When you go to influence, especially when you influence up, and again, I think we naturally do a bit more prep. When there's a power differential, we tend to do a little bit more prep, which is really good. But we tend to prep in terms of what we're going to say, the statements we're going to make, the arguments we're going to provide, the visuals that we're going to show to them. We are advocating for our idea. Very rarely do we prep in terms of thinking through the questions we're going to ask. This gets really important when you're influencing up. Again, high value on curiosity. They are really, really going to want to have you demonstrating that curiosity through some really good questions. Right? Let me see again. I'm going to pause for chat. Curiosity to me is such an underrated skill in all parts of our lives. I get really fired up about it. But let's see. Andrew says, what are your thoughts around more linear management structure versus top down? Your lecture absolutely makes sense. Many suggestions, though. Again, the question is not just being trustworthy or a decision maker, but how to work in an interoperable, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary environment. Medical space for me, everyone is on the same team. Yeah, so I'm trying to sort this out, Andrew. So what are your thoughts around more linear management structure versus top down? My specialty is actually exactly what you described. So that idea of interdisciplinary, the cross-functional teams. All of my work is around working cross-functionally. So that's actually the source of this model. And then in terms of more linear top down, I think I answered that with Bill's question. In terms, there's some certain things that take on added importance when it's a little bit more top down, and how do you recognize the value that they place on that kind of power. But in terms of that interdisciplinary, inner multidisciplinary environment, what I would call cross-functional, this is exactly it. This is what cross-functional teams are built on and how they influence people. And so when you're working on that, one of the biggest data points that I have is core teams in a medical situation. So core teams, core R&D teams, one of the biggest value there is understanding and appreciating the perspectives of others and verbalizing that. So that takes on added importance. So it's almost like the model is very humanistic, and then there's certain pieces of that model that take on a special importance if you're talking about a very hierarchical organization versus a very cross-functional organization, when you're talking about a team versus generally in the organization. Andrew, let me know if I answered that, because I'm not sure. I'm hoping I didn't skip through things. So please let me know if I answered that adequately. And while you're contemplating that, seek to understand. way, that's what it's all about, right? Like, how powerful is that? Good old Stephen Covey, 25 years ago, um, essential number one, right? Seven or habit number one, seek first to understand. Oh my gosh, the value in that. And the value that that places and communicates to the people that you're influencing. Absolutely. Okay, Andrew responded back exactly what we, exclamation point, I struggle with, is obtaining the knowledge of those who don't speak up. Okay, so obtaining the knowledge of those that don't speak up. Yeah, so um, it's interesting. So that's an interesting dynamic. And it's an interesting one because you're absolutely right, Andrew. In we only know what people are willing to tell us, right? That's where our knowledge comes from. And so if they're not willing to tell us, I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the why behind that? Right. So before I could answer that question, I'd probably need to know a whole bunch of whys. So why don't they speak up? Are they not speaking up specifically to you or to certain groups or to certain stakeholders or in general? But yeah, like that is if very difficult to build knowledge if you are not surrounded by people who are willing to share because you only know what people are willing to tell you. Great. Yeah, siloed positions. Yeah. Yep. Those silos are compelling, right? And I do this and only this, and I share within my silo. I don't share across. Yeah, that's a really big cultural issue that is beyond our scope, but those are great questions, Andrew, and would love to talk to you offline on that. Um, that's what I do, the siloed positions, the siloed organizations. So you're absolutely right on it. All right, so let me see. Let's take a look at tip three. I kind of already got to it. See what they see. And so again, that's that leader perspective. So that's what that curiosity gives you is to see what they see. So see the problem from multiple perspectives, see the implications of the solution from multiple perspectives, see the strategic and the big picture connections. Your weakest point of influence is when it's just focused on you and you can't link your need or your idea to something bigger than you. And so to be able to do that, you've got to have broad perspective in general, but specifically around the influence opportunity that you're tackling at that moment. So again, from the research, this is what comes out as huge for those higher in the organization. All right. And then tip number 4, make it meaningful to them. Oh, I got a lot on this one. Um, so um, tip number 4 is all about it's about the talk, right? So when you are positioning your idea with something with someone higher up in the organization, the words you choose are incredibly important, right? So what we call it in influencing is framing. And so a frame is the first 1 to 2 sentences in a conversation, first slide of a presentation, maybe the first, paragraph in an email that really positions your ideas. And it either gets them interested and engaged and wanting to listen and hear you out, or it can completely turn them off. So the words that you choose are incredibly important. Those words that you choose in those first 1 to 2 sentences are really, really critical. So let me give you an example of this. Um, so when I was still working internally, um, I was in HR and I was working in the staffing area of HR. And one of the organizations within that company that I supported was an inside sales organization. And the inside sales organization was like, I don't know, 30 or 35 people. And the name of the gentleman who headed that was Ron. And, an inside sales position is a very measurable position, right? Just like any sales position, it's very quantitative. And so you can see when somebody's pulling their weight and somebody's not, right? As an HR person, I valued that data so much because all the other groups that I supported had no quantifiable way to say this person is doing, this person is not. So for me, having quantitative data was a big deal. So Ron had one person on his team who was consistently missing numbers. And so each month I would go in to my one-on-one with Ron and I would say, Ron, Bob's not cutting it. Like, you need to fire him. Like, he missed his numbers again. Right. And so to me, that data was compelling. Like, if I saw that month after month after month, fire him. You got cause. There it is right there. And he'd say, no, 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 Susan, that's not fair. No, he's been with the company a long time. I'd try again. Oh, he missed him again, Ron. You got to do something. Oh no, it's close to the holidays, or he's got a family, or he's like whatever it is. It was all about not fair to Bob, not fair to Bob. So finally, after about 6 months of me presenting data and Ron going, no, 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 I said, I need to see it from his perspective. And I need to have the words that I choose reflect his perspective. And his perspective was around fairness. And so I went back to him. I said, Ron, this is not fair to your team. They have to hustle and scramble at the end of every month to make up for the fact that Bob missed his numbers again. That is not fair to them. And that's what got him. He agreed to let this person go because of the fairness to his team. So I didn't change my idea with Ron. I changed the words that I chose so that it would reflect what's important to him, right? Fairness was important to him, was a value to him. And so I just helped him see that in what I was proposing. So that's an example of the words that you choose. The next one, problem versus solution. This is a really common issue. Oftentimes, especially when we're influencing up, we present a solution before they even see it as a problem. So it's always very easy to reject a solution if you don't see the problem, right? So my example of that is I was part of a leadership a monthly leadership meeting, and I took upon myself to reconfigure the meetings because people were kind of complaining about them and weren't getting a lot out of them. So I walked into the president's office and I said, Dave, nobody's getting a lot out of your meetings, which is a terrible thing to say and terrible frame. And here are my ideas on how to fix it. Dave's the president of a $7 billion business unit. He thought his meetings were just fine, not a value to him. They were working for him. He didn't see the problem. There's no way he gave a darn about my solution. So understand that sometimes you got to back up a little bit and influence that there is a problem before you jump to your solution. And then the final one is to understand what their decision-making style is. Everybody makes decisions differently. Some people base it on data and analytics. Some people base it on who else is doing this, right? So they're kind of what I call an imitator. Some people are bigger picture, right? And they need to see the new, the different, the strategic. Some people really want to be part of the solution, not just a yes or no person. They want to be hands-on. So understand what their decision-making style is and shape your message around that as well. They're an analytic person, start with the analytics. If they're not an analytic person, don't start with analytics. I'm not an analytic person. And I had a team who was all very analytic, and they would come to influence me, to convince me of something, and they would start with so much data, and my eyes would glaze over. I finally had to tell them, guys, give me big picture first, get me interested and engaged, and then I will ask you questions to drill down in the data when I'm interested and on what I am interested in. So taking into account how they make decisions is really important in terms of how you position your idea as well. So those are the 4 tips. Let me look at our chats. Oh my goodness, we got a bunch now. Wonderful. Okay. Did you somehow miss tip 3? You did not. Tip 3 was see what they see. We had actually already covered it in curiosity. So you're curious, so you can see what they can see. Let's see. To Andrew's question, discussions around the success of the team depends on the contribution. Yes, the success of the team, the success of the project, right? Depends on it. The success of, the value to whoever your end user is at risk. I mean, that's a really important mindset. When you're working in an organization, your relationships and your communication matter. They're not nice to have. They impact work products, they impact end users. Yep, absolutely. Yes, Lencioni's got a great book on that. Um, Regarding those not speaking up, this is from Aaron. How do you take into account and introverts versus extroverts and overall thinking styles too? Um, when I think about introverts, I always make sure that if I am influencing them, that I start with some pre-work with them, right? I give them some things to consider beforehand. They are a sit and think. They're probably not going to say yes in the moment because they might think afterwards as well. So I adjust my strategy and my timing based on that. Um, when I have a mix, like if I'm influencing a group, I'm going to have to be ready to make sure that I can facilitate in a way that the extroverts get their say because they're verbal processors, right? But that we don't focus all on them. And so I'll pause conversations, make sure I'm pulling those introverts out, especially if they're well prepared and they know what they're talking about and they reviewed it, they're going to be much more ready to jump in as well. So absolutely the introvert extrovert piece plays into that big time. Um, let's see. Use written tools, online surveys for introverts. Yes, yes, absolutely. Versus outline brainstorming. Absolutely. Use different ways except verbal to get some of that those pieces out. Absolutely. I will, when I'm in a group, I'll throw out a question and I'll have everybody write down their response and their ideas and then share them. What happens with that is that you don't have the first person's response take the discussion all the way over there. You're going to have a little bit of a balance and you'll have introverts that are more ready to bring out their ideas. Yep, absolutely. Use a lot of written stuff. How do you determine a higher ups decision making style? Couple of things on that. Ask others, right? So if you haven't interacted with them, ask others what they think their decision, how do they make decisions? Um, I love to, if I'm influencing someone and I don't know their style, I will fire off an email and say, hey, I've got time on your calendar next week to talk about this. What questions do you have? Their questions will indicate what they value, and that will indicate what decision making style they are. So those are two really good ones. And of course, you can be very direct and ask them as well. Right. Good. How do you make decisions? If my team had asked me that, we would have shortcutted things quite a bit. Here's how I make decisions. Like start big picture with me. That's the best, that is the best way to really get it is to ask directly. Let's see, Jason, relationship selling. Okay, another great one. Thank you very much. Terrific. Right. So, any other questions, everybody? Here is a summary of your tips. Any other questions? I love the questions coming through as we went, so that's great. Oh, looks like I've got some in the Q&A too. Let me grab this from Jen. Okay, she's got a part one, part two. Okay, two part, but connected questions. Love it. As you said, being trusted and having knowledge of the organization is important to influence as well. Do you have any advice for people who are new to their organizations that are still building their reputation, knowledge, and influence to be successful influence while building to improved influence later? Love this question, John. You guys are asking some really terrific questions. So what I find, and again, this is a really um, interesting bit of research, is when you're newer in the organization, and if you were to take my assessment, you will score off the charts and be prepared, right? I mean, absolutely off the charts because as a new person, you have to prepare so much more. You have to have so many more questions, right? And really think through stakeholders and really craft your agenda. You will score off the chart and prepare because that's the part of the model you can control. Because you don't have all the knowledge yet, you don't have all the partnerships yet, but you can control how much you prepare. And then when I look at people who are highly tenured in an organization, they score really low in prepare and really high in partnerships, and really high in knowledge, and they're resting on their laurels, right? Like I know enough people and I know enough that I can wing it. And so just to be really cognizant of that, and if you're influencing something, even if you've been there for a long time and you got a lot of partners and it's something really important, that doesn't mean you can shortcut the strategy of this and the prep around that. So Jen, I think my advice to you is, continue. You've got a window as a new person to ask all the stupid questions. So continue to reach out, grabbing 10 minutes with someone, to build. Like, people are usually pretty understanding. I'm new. Can I grab 10 minutes for you? I've got questions around this. So continue. Don't close that window too soon. Like, oh, I should know this already, and stop asking questions. So take advantage of your new as your your prologue. I'm new, so I have questions here. So don't stop asking questions, and realize where you're going to get traction is in your prep. As you're building partnerships and you're building knowledge, you're going to be able to leverage that prep piece. And in that prep, you're going to be building knowledge and partnerships as well. But that's the piece of the model you're going to be able to run with, when you're new. Let me see, make sure that I got that. Yes, that's it. Okay, part two for Jen. Do you have any advice for people that are new to positions that require a lot of influence, including overcoming a sense of imposter syndrome? Oh, God, I love this question. Um, yeah, so imposter imposter syndrome, when you're new, don't have it. I know that sounds silly, but here, I'm going to tell you a quick story. Um, I went to grad school at Indiana, and I taught there. So I was their TA program at the time was really cool. Like, you get your own classroom. Like, you're on your own. You're teaching. And I had to teach a public speaking class. And you wouldn't know it now because I think I've overcome it, but I barely eked out a C in public speaking, like my freshman year of college, right? Like, I barely. So I'm walking to my first class to teach public speaking, in my head going, holy cow, I barely passed that class. And I finally said, nobody knows that. And I know that I had some really amazing instructors. Nobody here knows that fact. And nobody here even knows me as an instructor. I'm going to be the instructor that I was on the receiving end of. And they won't even know I'm faking it right now. And pretty soon I'll fake it and I'll make it. And they'll be none the wiser. The same is true in a new organization, right? They don't know the old Jen and how she influences. So they won't see you as an imposter. I think the imposter syndrome never goes away 100%, right? My best friend in college is one of the highest, she is the highest ranked woman in one of the world's largest banks. And she says to me every time she gets a promotion, Sue, they're going to find me out this time. They're going to realize I don't know this stuff. So she's 50, she's going to be 60 this year, and she still thinks like that. So it never completely leaves us. But when you're new to an organization, know that they don't have the before to compare you against. Try stuff. That's actually a time where you're free to try, and they're not going to go, what's up with Jen? That's not how she talks. That's not how she handles it. So it's a little bit more open. So hopefully that answered your question, Jen. Feel free to ask a follow-up. Looks like I've got one in Q&A. Yep, that one's answered. Terrific. Any other questions, guys?
So while we give some people time to submit some additional questions, thank you, Susan, for this today. And in the meantime, I did want to let everyone know that CPED is ready to help you, your team, and your team members and your organization further develop influencing skills. Trinity would absolutely love to set up a chat to talk with you about our How to Influence Without Direct Authority program and how we can customize it for your organization. Her email is on the slide there, and she would love to have you reach out to her and explore further opportunities with your organizations. So thank you all for coming today. We'll give just a couple minutes for anyone else to submit submit any additional questions. There will be a recording sent out a couple of days after this. We just need a little time to get it processed and ready to go out. And then that will be sent out to everyone that registered for the webinar.
All right. Awesome. Great questions, you guys. Thank you so much. You were an awesome virtual audience. Go forth and influence would be my request for you. Go get them.